The smoke billowed thick and menacing across the open plain, turning the afternoon sky an eerie orange-red as Elisabeth Nelson stared in horror at the approaching wildfire. She had known the drought-stricken summer of 1878 would be dangerous, but nothing had prepared her for this inferno racing toward her small homestead just outside Silver Creek, Colorado territory. The crackling roar grew louder with each passing second, and the horses in her stable whinnied in panic. Her lungs burned as she frantically tried to gather what little she could save. "Miss, we need to leave now." The voice cut through her panic, deep and commanding. Elisabeth spun around to find a tall figure silhouetted against the smoke, a man she'd never seen before, sitting atop a muscular palomino, his face partially concealed by a bandana pulled over his nose and mouth. "My horses!" she cried, clutching her small bundle of possessions. "I can't leave them." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion. "I'll help. But we've got minutes, not hours." Together they rushed to the small stable where her 3 horses stomped and neighed in terror. The man worked with practiced efficiency, untying the first horse and leading it out, while Elisabeth followed with the second. The smoke was thickening, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "What about the last one?" Elisabeth coughed, her eyes stinging. "No time," he said grimly, grabbing her arm. "Fire's too close." A thunderous crack split the air as a burning tree limb crashed onto the roof of her cabin. Sparks showered around them, and the horses reared in terror. "Mount up!" the stranger commanded, practically lifting her onto her mare. He swung onto his palomino, took the reins of her second horse, and pointed toward the north. They were surrounded by smoke, thickening by the second. The cowboy turned to her, his blue eyes startlingly clear against his soot-stained face. "Keep your eyes on the light ahead," he said, gesturing to a faint glow in the distance. "Don't look back, just ride." Elisabeth didn't hesitate. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks and followed him into the smoky haze, leaving behind everything she had worked for over the past 2 years. The sound of the fire consuming her home faded only as the thundering of hooves beneath them grew louder. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the air gradually clearing as they put distance between themselves and the wildfire. When they finally slowed to a walk, Elisabeth's entire body ached, and tears had cut clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "We're safe now," the man said, pulling down his bandana. His face was lean and weathered, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, piercing blue, like the Colorado sky on a clear winter morning. "Thank you," Elisabeth managed, her voice raw from smoke. "You saved my life. And my horses." "Levi Blackburn," he said with a slight nod, "was passing through when I saw the smoke. Couldn't leave someone to face that alone." "Elisabeth Nelson," she replied, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "I owe you everything, Mr. Blackburn." He shook his head. "Call me Levi, and you owe me nothing." He glanced back toward the horizon where an orange glow still marked the fire's path. "But you'll need a place to stay. Silver Creek's not far. I know a boarding house there." Elisabeth felt her heart sink as the reality of her situation washed over her. Everything she owned was gone: her cabin, her garden, her father's tools, her mother's quilt. All that remained were the clothes on her back, 1 horse, and the small satchel of valuables she'd managed to grab. "I don't have much money," she admitted. "We'll figure something out," Levi said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "First, let's get you somewhere safe for the night." As they rode toward Silver Creek, Elisabeth stole glances at her rescuer. There was something about him, a quiet confidence perhaps, or the way he sat so naturally in the saddle, that made her curious. But there was also a wariness in his eyes, as though he carried burdens she couldn't see. Silver Creek appeared before them just as twilight descended, a small frontier town with one main street, a collection of wooden buildings, and the promise of safety. As they approached, Elisabeth felt a mixture of relief and dread. She was alive, but she was also homeless, nearly penniless, and dependent on the kindness of a stranger in a town where she knew no one. Levi led her to a modest two-story building with a sign that read, Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. He dismounted and offered his hand to help her down. Elisabeth hesitated only a moment before accepting it, noticing the strength in his grip and the calluses that spoke of a life of hard work. "Wait here," he said, tying the horses to the hitching post. "Let me speak with Mrs. Holloway." While he disappeared inside, Elisabeth took stock of herself. Her dress was torn and smoke-stained, her hands dirty, and her hair had come loose from its pins. She did her best to smooth her appearance, but knew she must look like she'd been dragged through hell itself. Levi returned a few minutes later with a plump, gray-haired woman whose kind face immediately set Elisabeth at ease. "My goodness, child!" the woman exclaimed, hurrying down the steps. "Mr. Blackburn told me what happened. You poor dear. Come inside at once. I'm Martha Holloway." "Elisabeth Nelson," she replied, overwhelmed by the woman's kindness. "I'm afraid I don't have much to pay you with right now." Mrs. Holloway waved away her concerns. "Nonsense. Any friend of Levi's is welcome here. We can discuss payment later." "We're not exactly," Elisabeth began, but Levi cut her off. "I've settled your first week," he said quietly. "After that, we'll figure things out." Before she could protest, Mrs. Holloway was ushering her inside, promising hot food, a bath, and clean clothes. Elisabeth glanced back at Levi, still standing near the horses. "You're not coming in?" Something flickered across his face. Hesitation, perhaps. "No, madam. I've got business elsewhere. But I'll check on you tomorrow." Elisabeth wanted to thank him properly, to ask him 100 questions, but Mrs. Holloway was already pulling her through the door. By the time she looked back again, Levi Blackburn had mounted his palomino and was riding away into the gathering darkness. The next morning, after the first decent night's sleep she'd had in months, despite her circumstances, Elisabeth woke feeling surprisingly determined. She had lost everything, yes, but she was alive, and she would rebuild. She'd done it before, after all, when her parents died and left her alone in the world. Mrs. Holloway provided her with a simple but clean dress that had belonged to her daughter, now married and living in Denver. Over a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and strong coffee, Elisabeth learned more about Silver Creek and its inhabitants. "The town's growing," Mrs. Holloway explained. "With the railroad coming through next year, there are opportunities for those willing to work hard." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Elisabeth said. "I ran my homestead alone for 2 years." Mrs. Holloway looked impressed. "Most young women your age would have given up or found a husband to help." Elisabeth smiled wryly. "My father taught me to be self-reliant, and finding a husband wasn't exactly a priority when there was land to clear and crops to plant." "Well, there might be work at the general store," Mrs. Holloway suggested. "Mr. Parker mentioned needing help. His last clerk left to try his luck in the goldfields." After breakfast, Elisabeth ventured out to explore Silver Creek. It was larger than she'd realized the night before, with a general store, a bank, a sheriff's office, 2 saloons, a small church, and various other businesses lining the dusty main street. People nodded politely as she passed, but she felt their curious gazes. A young woman alone was always the subject of speculation in small towns. At the general store, Mr. Parker, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, seemed dubious about hiring her at first. "A lady clerk isn't exactly traditional," he said, eyeing her carefully. "Neither is a lady homesteader," Elisabeth countered. "But I can read, write, and do figures as well as any man. Better than most, in fact." After a brief questioning about her background and abilities, Mr. Parker relented. "Very well, Miss Nelson. You can start tomorrow. The pay is modest, but fair. Relief washed over her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to earn money for new supplies, perhaps even enough to eventually rebuild her homestead. As she stepped out of the store, she nearly collided with a broad chest. Looking up, she found herself staring into the now familiar blue eyes of Levi Blackburn. "Mr. Blackburn," she said, surprised. "You came back." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Said I would. How are you settling in?" "Well enough," she replied. "I've just secured employment at the general store." Something like approval flashed in his eyes. "That's good. Parker's a fair man." An awkward silence fell between them. Elisabeth had spent the night thinking about this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life, wondering who he was, what his story might be. Up close, in the daylight, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s or early 30s, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled more than his serious demeanor indicated. "Mr. Blackburn." "Levi," he corrected. "Levi," she amended. "I never properly thanked you for what you did. You risked your life for a stranger." He shifted uncomfortably, as if unused to gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. And I need to repay you for the boarding house." "No need," he said. "Consider it a welcome to Silver Creek." Before she could insist further, a young boy ran up to them, breathless with excitement. "Mr. Blackburn, sheriff's looking for you. Says it's urgent." Levi's expression darkened slightly. "Tell him I'll be right there." As the boy scampered off, he turned back to Elisabeth. "Duty calls, Miss Nelson." "Elisabeth," she corrected with a small smile. "And what duty is that? Are you a deputy?" He hesitated, as if debating how much to tell her. "Something like that. I track people who don't want to be found." "A bounty hunter?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. His mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Bounty hunter, tracker, occasional lawman. Depends who's asking." With that cryptic response, he replaced his hat, nodded politely, and strode toward the sheriff's office, leaving Elisabeth with more questions than answers about the mysterious man who had saved her life. Over the next week, Elisabeth fell into a routine in Silver Creek. She worked at the general store during the days, learning the inventory and becoming acquainted with the townspeople who came in to shop. In the evenings, she dined with Mrs. Holloway and the other boarders, a schoolteacher, an elderly widow, and occasionally a traveling salesman. Of Levi Blackburn, she saw little. She learned from town gossip that he had ridden out with the sheriff the day after their conversation, tracking a gang that had robbed the stagecoach 2 counties over. His absence shouldn't have bothered her. He was, after all, little more than a stranger who had shown her kindness, but Elisabeth found herself looking up whenever the store door opened, hoping to see his tall figure. "You've got it bad, don't you?" Nora Spencer, the young schoolteacher who also boarded with Mrs. Holloway, commented one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. "I don't know what you mean," Elisabeth replied, focusing on the mending in her lap. Nora laughed, a bright sound in the quiet evening. "Every time someone mentions Levi Blackburn, you get this look." "What look?" "Like you're trying very hard not to look interested, which only makes it more obvious that you are." Elisabeth felt her cheeks warm. "He saved my life. I'm simply curious about him." Nora hummed skeptically. "Well, if it helps satisfy your curiosity, I've lived here 2 years, and Levi Blackburn remains an enigma to most folks in Silver Creek. He comes and goes, sometimes disappearing for weeks. He's polite but private. The children adore him because he occasionally brings them candy from his travels. The sheriff trusts him implicitly, but no one knows much about his past." "Has he always been a bounty hunter?" Nora shrugged. "As long as I've known him. There are rumors, of course." "What kind of rumors?" Some say he was once an outlaw himself, reformed after a near-death experience. Others think he's hunting one particular man, some nemesis from his past. A few believe he's actually a Pinkerton agent working undercover. And what do you believe? Elisabeth asked. Nora considered for a moment. I believe he's a good man with secrets. Don't we all have those? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Both women looked up to see a small group of riders coming down the main street, dust billowing around them in the fading light. Speak of the devil, Nora murmured. Elisabeth's heart skipped as she recognized Levi riding at the front alongside Sheriff Coleman. Behind them, 3 men with their hands bound rode with grim expressions. Looks like they caught the stagecoach robbers, Nora observed. The group stopped at the jail, and Elisabeth watched as Levi helped the sheriff escort the prisoners inside. Even from a distance, she could see the weariness in his movements, the way he slightly favored his right leg. He's hurt, she said, standing abruptly. Nora caught her arm. Let the man rest first, Elisabeth. Whatever you want to say to him can wait until morning. Reluctantly, Elisabeth agreed, though she found sleep elusive that night, her mind filled with images of Levi wounded and alone. The next morning, she rose early and prepared a basket with fresh bread from Mrs. Holloway's kitchen, some preserves, and cheese. On her way to work, she stopped at the small cabin on the edge of town that she had learned belonged to Levi. She hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing, bringing food to a man she barely knew? But concern overrode her hesitation, and she knocked firmly. Long moments passed with no answer. She was about to leave when the door opened to reveal Levi, barefoot and shirtless, a bandage wrapped around his upper arm. His hair was tousled from sleep, and he blinked at her in surprise. Elisabeth? She immediately averted her eyes from his bare chest, feeling heat rise to her face. I saw you return yesterday. You seemed injured. I brought some food. She thrust the basket forward. He didn't take it immediately, and when she dared look up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You didn't need to do that, he said finally, accepting the basket. I wanted to. She gestured to his bandaged arm. What happened? One of the robbers had a knife. It's just a scratch. May I see? I have some experience with treating wounds. He hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider in silent invitation. His cabin was Spartan but neat, a small table and chair, a narrow bed in one corner, a wood stove, and shelves holding few personal possessions. What caught her attention, though, was the bookshelf filled with volumes, an unexpected sight in a bounty hunter's home. You read? She said, unable to hide her surprise. Is that so hard to believe? There was a touch of defensiveness in his voice. No, She smiled. I love books too. My father had quite a collection before. She trailed off, the memory of her lost possessions still painful. Something in Levi's expression softened. You're welcome to borrow any of these. He gestured to the shelf. Now, about that arm. She set down her basket and approached him cautiously. Let me see. He unwrapped the bandage, revealing a clean slice about 4 inches long on his upper arm. Someone had stitched it neatly, but the skin around it was red and slightly swollen. It's showing signs of infection, she said, gently touching the skin near the wound. Do you have any whiskey? He raised an eyebrow but reached for a bottle on a high shelf. Elisabeth took it and poured some over a clean cloth she found folded on his table. This will sting, she warned, then carefully cleaned around the wound. Levi didn't flinch, though she knew it must have hurt. As she worked, she was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his skin, of the steady rise and fall of his chest. You've done this before, he observed. My father was a doctor before we came west, she explained, rewrapping his arm with a fresh bandage. He taught me what he could. Why did you leave? To come west, I mean. Elisabeth hesitated, not used to sharing her story. My mother died when I was 16. Father decided we needed a fresh start. We homesteaded in Colorado, built a life. Then he died 2 years ago, pneumonia. I kept the homestead going on my own until the fire, he finished quietly. She nodded, securing the bandage. Your turn. How does a man who reads Shakespeare become a bounty hunter? A shadow crossed his face. It's a long story. I've got time before the store opens, she said, settling into his single chair. Levi sighed, reaching for a shirt hanging on a peg. As he carefully pulled it on, he seemed to be deciding how much to tell her. I was a teacher once, he said finally, the admission clearly costing him something. Back east, in Pennsylvania. I taught literature at a small school. Of all the possibilities Nora had mentioned, this was one Elisabeth hadn't considered. What changed? The war, he said simply. Like many men, I enlisted, fought for the Union. When I came back, I couldn't settle. The classroom felt too small, too confined. I needed open spaces, movement. So you came west. He nodded. Tried my hand at ranching first. Didn't take to it. Then scouting for the army. Eventually fell into tracking fugitives. Turns out I have a knack for finding people who don't want to be found. Do you ever miss teaching? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Sometimes, when I meet someone who appreciates books as much as I do. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits, despite their different paths. The moment was broken by the distant church bell tolling 8 o'clock. I should go, Elisabeth said, rising quickly. The store opens at past. Elisabeth, Levi called as she reached the door. Thank you for the food and... He gestured to his bandaged arm. You saved my life, she reminded him. It's the least I could do. As she hurried toward the general store, Elisabeth realized her heart was beating faster than her brisk walk warranted. There was something about Levi Blackburn, something in the way he looked at her, in the unexpected depth she'd glimpsed behind his reserved exterior, that made her want to know more. But she reminded herself firmly that she had more pressing concerns than her growing fascination with the town's enigmatic bounty hunter. She needed to focus on rebuilding her life, not complicating it with feelings for a man who, by his own admission, couldn't settle in one place. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and planning. Elisabeth proved herself invaluable at the general store, organizing inventory and suggesting new merchandise that might appeal to the town's growing population of women and families. Mr. Parker was impressed enough to increase her wages slightly, which allowed her to begin saving for her future. She also became more integrated into Silver Creek's community. Mrs. Holloway introduced her to the Ladies' Aid Society, and Nora invited her to help with special reading lessons at the schoolhouse. Slowly, Elisabeth began to feel less like an outsider and more like she belonged. During this time, she saw Levi occasionally around town at the general store buying supplies, at the sheriff's office in conversation with Coleman, once at church on a Sunday morning, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and polished boots. Each time they exchanged polite greetings, sometimes stopping to chat briefly. He had returned her basket with a book from his collection, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry that she read by lamplight in her room. Despite their growing acquaintance, there remained a careful distance between them, as if both were wary of stepping too close to something neither was prepared to name. That changed on a cool autumn evening when Elisabeth was walking back to the boarding house after closing the store. The sun had set early, as it tended to do as winter approached, and the street was mostly deserted. She was passing the alley between the bank and the barber shop when a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind. Don't scream if you want to live, a harsh voice whispered in her ear as she was dragged backward into the shadows. Terror seized her as she felt the cold press of a knife against her throat. The man reeked of whiskey and unwashed clothes. "Your money," he demanded, turning her to face him. "And that pretty brooch, too." Elisabeth trembled but managed to remain composed enough to reach for her reticule. As she opened it, she deliberately let a few coins fall, forcing the man to look down. In that instant, she drove her knee upward with all her strength, just as her father had once taught her. The man howled and doubled over, but recovered quickly, his face contorting with rage. "You'll pay for that, you little—" He never finished his threat. A shadow materialized behind him, and suddenly, the would-be robber was slammed against the alley wall, a forearm pressed against his throat. "I suggest you reconsider your intentions." Levi's voice was deadly calm, but Elisabeth could hear the barely contained fury beneath it. "Blackburn," the man choked out, his eyes widening in recognition and fear. "Drop the knife," Levi commanded. The blade clattered to the ground. Levi eased his pressure slightly but kept the man pinned. "You know who I am?" Levi continued. "So you know what happens to men who harm innocent women on my watch." "I wasn't gonna hurt her," the man protested weakly. "Just wanted some money." "With a knife to her throat?" Levi pressed harder. "You have two choices. Leave town tonight and never return, or spend the next month in Sheriff Coleman's jail. Choose wisely." "I'll go," the man gasped. "I swear it." Levi released him but picked up the fallen knife. "I'll be watching. If you're still in Silver Creek by sunrise, I'll find you." The man didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the alley. Levi turned to Elisabeth, his expression shifting from menace to concern in an instant. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though she was trembling violently now that the danger had passed. "No, How did you find me?" "I was at the saloon," he said, gently guiding her out of the alley and into the lamplight of the main street. "Saw you walking alone. Thought I'd make sure you got back safely. Good thing I did." "Yes," she agreed softly. "Thank you." Again. He frowned, noticing a thin red line where the knife had pressed against her throat. His fingers brushed it lightly, and Elisabeth felt a jolt at his touch. "He could have killed you," Levi said, his voice rough with emotion. "But he didn't. Thanks to you." They stood there for a long moment, his hand still near her face, her eyes locked with his. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building since that first day in the smoke. "I should get you back to Mrs. Holloway's," he said finally, dropping his hand. "Would you—" Elisabeth hesitated, then found her courage. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow? As a thank you." Surprise flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "You don't need to thank me." "I want to," she insisted. "Please." After a moment, he nodded. "All right. Tomorrow then." He escorted her to the boarding house door, tipping his hat before melting back into the night. Elisabeth watched him go, her heart still racing though, whether from her encounter with the robber or her invitation to Levi, she couldn't quite say. The following evening, Elisabeth found herself fretting over her appearance more than she had in years. She'd washed her hair and pinned it in a style Nora had shown her, letting a few soft curls frame her face. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, with the cameo brooch that had been her mother's, the one the robber had tried to steal. Mrs. Holloway had agreed to let her use the small private dining room, usually reserved for special occasions, and had even prepared a special meal of roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. "You look lovely, dear, Mrs. Che," Holloway said with a knowing smile as Elisabeth nervously adjusted a vase of late wild flowers on the table. "It's just a thank you dinner," Elisabeth insisted, though her flushed cheeks suggested otherwise. "Of course it is," Mrs. Holloway patted her arm. "And if it happens to be something more, well, Levi Blackburn could use someone like you in his life. Before Elisabeth could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Mrs. Holloway hurried to answer it, returning moments later with Levi. Elisabeth's breath caught at the sight of him. He'd clearly made an effort, wearing a clean dark shirt under a well-fitted vest, his usually unruly hair combed neatly. He held his hat in his hands, looking almost as nervous as she felt. "Miss Nelson," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "Mr. Blackburn," she returned, a small smile playing at her lips. "I believe we agreed on first names some time ago." The tension broken, they sat down to dinner. The conversation flowed more easily than Elisabeth had expected, moving from town gossip to books they'd both read, to stories of their respective childhoods, his in a small Pennsylvania town, hers in Boston before her family moved west. "Have you given thought to what you'll do next?" Levi asked as they lingered over apple pie and coffee. "Will you try to rebuild your homestead?" Elisabeth sighed, setting down her fork. "I've been pondering that very question. Part of me wants to. That land was my father's dream, and I've put so much of myself into it. But starting over completely—" She shook her head. "It would take years, and significant capital I don't have." "You seem to have found a place here in Silver Creek," he observed. "I have," she admitted. "More than I expected to. The work at the store is satisfying, and I've made friends. Mrs. Holloway has even suggested I might take over running the boarding house someday, as she's considering moving to Denver to be closer to her daughter." "You'd be good at that," Levi said. "You have a way of making people feel welcome." Something in his tone made Elisabeth look up sharply. "Even solitary bounty hunters?" His lips quirked in that almost smile she was coming to recognize. "Especially those." As the evening wore on, Elisabeth found herself reluctant for it to end. There was something different about Levi tonight, a softening of his usual guardedness, as if he too was letting himself consider possibilities previously dismissed. When they finally rose from the table, he hesitated before reaching for something in his pocket. "I brought you something," he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's nothing fancy, but when I saw it, I thought of you." Surprised, Elisabeth unwrapped the gift to find a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with delicate flowers. "For your thoughts," Levi explained, looking almost shy. "You mentioned once that you used to keep a journal before the fire." "I did," she said softly, touched that he had remembered such a detail. "Thank you, Levi. It's perfect." Impulsively, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his cheek. When she pulled back, his eyes had darkened, and without warning, he leaned down to capture her lips with his own. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Elisabeth responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing rapidly, and Levi rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I first saw you standing in that smoke, refusing to leave your horses behind," he admitted. Elisabeth smiled, her heart soaring. "What took you so long then?" "I'm not—" He hesitated. "I'm not the kind of man who stays in one place, Elisabeth. My work takes me away for weeks, sometimes months. That's no kind of life to offer a woman like you." "Perhaps you should let me decide what kind of life I want," she countered. "I'm not asking for promises, Levi. Just a chance to see where this might lead." He searched her face, as if looking for reassurance. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he pulled her close again, his kiss this time containing a promise of its own. Their courtship progressed slowly over the following months. Levi continued his work as a bounty hunter, but Elisabeth noticed he took fewer jobs that required long absences from Silver Creek. When he was in town, they spent evenings together walking, talking, sharing meals at the boarding house or occasionally at his cabin. Elisabeth learned more about his past, about his time as a teacher, his experiences in the war that had left him with nightmares he rarely spoke of, his drift westward in search of something he couldn't quite name. In turn, she shared her own stories of her refined Boston upbringing, her father's decision to seek a new life in the West, her determination to honor his memory by keeping their homestead alive until the fire took it all. As winter descended on Silver Creek, bringing snow and bitter winds, Elisabeth found herself more content than she'd been in years. Her position at the general store had evolved into something closer to partnership than employment, with Mr. Parker increasingly relying on her judgment for ordering and accounts. She had a circle of friends, a community that valued her, and a man who looked at her as if she were the sunrise after a long, dark night. But shadows loomed on the horizon of their happiness. As spring approached, rumors began circulating about the Harmon Gang, notorious outlaws who had been terrorizing towns throughout Colorado and Wyoming. "They've hit 3 banks in the last month," Sheriff Coleman explained during a town meeting in March. "Violent men who don't hesitate to kill. If they come to Silver Creek, I want everyone prepared." The town council voted to hire additional deputies and post lookouts. Levi, with his tracking experience, was asked to help train the volunteers. "I don't like it," he confessed to Elisabeth one evening as they sat before the fire in his cabin. "The Harmons are different from the usual desperados. They plan carefully, strike fast, and they're ruthless." Elisabeth laid her hand over his. "The whole town is on alert. Surely they wouldn't risk attacking Silver Creek now." "I hope you're right." But the worry didn't leave his eyes, and that night he held her a little tighter before walking her back to the boarding house. 3 days later, Elisabeth was working late at the general store, finishing the monthly accounts while Mr. Parker attended a town council meeting. The shop was quiet, most customers having hurried home before sunset as a precaution against the rumored gang. She was just locking the cash box when the bell above the door jingled. Looking up with a ready smile, Elisabeth froze at the sight of 3 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals whose hands hovered near holstered guns. "We're closed," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The tallest of the 3, a man with a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw, smiled coldly. "Now that's not very hospitable, madam. We're just passing through. Need some supplies." "You can return in the morning," Elisabeth said, her hand discreetly moving toward the shotgun Mr. Parker kept under the counter. The man's eyes narrowed. "I don't think so." He drew his gun with alarming speed. "You're going to open that safe in the back room, and then you're going to stay very quiet while we help ourselves to whatever else we need." Elisabeth's blood ran cold. How did he know about the safe? Only she, Mr. Parker, and the bank manager were supposed to know it contained the week's deposits, waiting for tomorrow's transfer to the bank. "I don't have the combination," she lied. The man's smile turned ugly. "Now, we both know that's not true, Miss Nelson." The use of her name sent a shock through her. These weren't random bandits they'd planned this. Known she would be alone, known about the safe. They were the Harmon Gang, and they'd been watching Silver Creek, learning its routines. Before she could respond, the back door of the shop burst open and Levi appeared, gun drawn. "Step away from her," he commanded, his voice like steel. The scarred man spun, but his companions already had their weapons aimed at Levi. "Well, well, Levi Blackburn," the scarred man drawled. "We heard you might be in these parts. You've been quite a thorn in our side, tracking down our associates." "Harmon," Levi acknowledged, his eyes flicking briefly to Elisabeth. "Let the lady go. This is between us." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Harmon replied. "We need what's in that safe, and Miss Nelson here is going to open it for us." "Like hell she is," Levi growled. Elisabeth saw the tension in his posture, knew he was calculating odds, looking for an opening. With 3 guns trained on him, those odds were grim. "Levi," she said softly, "don't." His eyes met hers, a silent communication passing between them. He was telling her to be ready, that he had a plan. She gave him the slightest nod. "Smart woman," Harmon said. "Now put down your gun, Blackburn, or my friend here will put a bullet in her pretty head." Slowly, Levi lowered his weapon to the floor. One of Harmon's men moved forward to retrieve it. In that instant, several things happened at once. Levi kicked his own gun under a display table, diving for cover as he did. Elisabeth dropped to the floor behind the counter, reaching for the shotgun. And from outside came the sound of gunshots. Sheriff Coleman and his deputies, alerted by the lookout who had spotted the strangers entering town. "It's a trap!" one of Harmon's men shouted as bullets splintered through the store's front window. Chaos erupted. Harmon and his men returned fire, using the store's shelves for cover. Levi crawled toward Elisabeth, who had the shotgun ready but hadn't yet fired. "Stay down," he whispered, reaching her side. "The sheriff's men have the building surrounded." "They knew my name, Levi," she said, her voice shaking. "They knew about the safe." His expression darkened. "Someone in town must be working with them. But right now, we need to focus on getting out of here alive." The gunfight intensified, with Harmon's gang pinned down but still dangerous. Smoke from gunpowder filled the store, making it difficult to see clearly. "We need to move to the back room," Levi said, eyeing the growing haze. "If a stray bullet hits the lamp oil." As if summoned by his words, there was a crash and a whoosh as a bullet struck a shelf of kerosene lamps. Fire spread rapidly along the wooden countertop. "Go!" Levi shouted, pushing Elisabeth toward the back of the store as flames licked up the dry goods shelf. They crawled through the smoke, the sound of gunfire continuing as the sheriff's men and Harmon's gang exchanged shots. When they reached the office door, Levi helped Elisabeth inside, then turned back toward the main store. "Where are you going?" she cried, grabbing his arm. "I can't leave Coleman to face them alone," he said grimly. "Get out through the back door. Run to the sheriff's office, it's the safest place." "No," she refused, clutching his sleeve. "Not without you." "Elisabeth, please." A figure appeared in the doorway. Harmon, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Neither of you is going anywhere," he snarled, raising his gun. Levi shoved Elisabeth behind him, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Time seemed to slow as Harmon's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot that rang out didn't come from Harmon's gun. Instead, the outlaw jerked backward, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the floor. Behind him stood Mr. Parker, an old army revolver in his trembling hand. "Mr. Parker," Elisabeth gasped. "Couldn't let him hurt my best employee," the shopkeeper said, his voice unsteady, "or the man she loves." There was no time for gratitude. The fire had spread to the main beam of the ceiling and smoke billowed through the store. "We need to get out now," Levi urged, taking Elisabeth's hand. "Parker, is there another way?" "The loading door," Mr. Parker said, pointing to a large door at the back of the storeroom. "It opens to the alley." Together they made their way through the smoky storeroom. Outside, the gunfire had stopped, suggesting the battle was over. But the danger wasn't past. The entire store was now engulfed in flames, the smoke so thick it was almost impossible to see. They were surrounded by smoke as they fumbled with the heavy door. Elisabeth felt a terrible déjà vu, remembering that day at her homestead when she'd lost everything to fire. Levi seemed to sense her fear. He turned to her, his face barely visible in the thickening smoke, and took her hand. "Keep your eyes on the light ahead," he said, pointing to where the door was beginning to open, revealing a sliver of clear night air beyond. "Don't look back. Just move forward." With those words, the same ones he'd spoken on the day they met, he gave her the strength to push through her fear. Together, the three of them forced the door open and stumbled into the alley, gasping for fresh air. Sheriff Coleman and his deputies found them there moments later, confirming that the remaining members of the Harmon gang were either dead or captured. The town had rallied to fight the fire, forming a bucket brigade from the nearby well, but it was clear the general store couldn't be saved. "I'm ruined," Mr. Parker said, as they watched the flames consume his livelihood. 20 years of work, gone in minutes. "No, you're not," Elisabeth said firmly. "We'll rebuild. Better than before." Levi put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "She's right. Silver Creek takes care of its own." In the aftermath of the fire and gunfight, the town indeed rallied. A temporary general store was set up in an empty building while plans were made to rebuild Parker's shop. The captured member of the Harmon gang revealed that they'd had an informant in town, a drifter who'd worked briefly at the livery stable, and had observed the town's routines, including the general store's banking practices. For Elisabeth, the experience had crystallized something she'd been feeling for months. As she and Levi sat on the porch of the boarding house a week after the incident, she turned to him with newfound certainty. "I'm not going to rebuild my homestead," she said. "My place is here now, in Silver Creek." Levi took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "The fire that brought me here was devastating, but it also led me to you, to this community. I've found something here I never had out there on my own, a sense of belonging." He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn, velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks," he admitted, waiting for the right moment. "After what happened at the store, I realized there might never be a perfect time in this imperfect world." Elisabeth's heart began to race as he opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've held on to it all these years, never thinking I'd find someone I wanted to give it to. Then I met a stubborn, brave woman in the midst of a wildfire, and everything changed." He slid from the chair to one knee, taking her hand. "Elisabeth Nelson, I know I'm not the steadiest man, not the kind most women would choose, but if you'll have me, I promise to love you every day of my life, to build something lasting with you here in Silver Creek." Tears welled in Elisabeth's eyes. "Are you saying you'll stay? Give up tracking?" "I'm saying I want to come home to you," he answered. "Maybe I'll work more with Sheriff Coleman, focus on keeping the peace locally. Or perhaps I'll take up teaching again. This town could use a proper school as it grows." "Levi Blackburn," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would love nothing more than to be your wife." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, Elisabeth thought of that day months ago when they'd ridden through smoke together. Two strangers whose paths had crossed in the most desperate of circumstances. How could she have known then that the man guiding her toward safety would ultimately lead her home? Their wedding took place that June in Silver Creek's newly built church. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which doubled as a grand opening for the rebuilt general store now called Parker and Nelson General Merchandise, reflecting Elisabeth's new partnership with the old shopkeeper. Mrs. Holloway had indeed decided to move to Denver to be with her daughter, and she sold the boarding house to Elisabeth and Levi at a price that reflected her affection for them both. They planned to maintain it as a boarding house while living in private quarters, creating a home where travelers and newcomers to Silver Creek would always find a welcome. After the wedding festivities, as twilight painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Levi led his bride to a hill overlooking the town. From there, they could see Silver Creek spread out below them, the church steeple, the main street with its hitching posts and wooden sidewalks, the gleaming new general store, and their own boarding house, with its welcoming porch. "It's not grand," Levi said, his arm around Elisabeth's waist, "but it's ours." "It's perfect," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Do you remember what you said to me that day we met? When we were surrounded by smoke and I was terrified?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Keep your eyes on the light ahead." "I remember." "You were my light, Levi," she said softly, "leading me out of the darkness. showing me the way forward when I'd lost everything. And you were mine, he answered, turning her to face him. I'd been wandering for so long, Elisabeth, looking for something I couldn't name. It was you. It was always going to be you. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they sealed their promise with a kiss, two souls who had found in each other not just love, but home. 5 years later, Elisabeth stood on the porch of their boarding house, watching as Levi taught their 3-year-old son James to ride his first pony in the side yard. Their 1-year-old daughter, Margaret, babbled happily in her arms, reaching chubby hands toward her father and brother. Silver Creek had grown substantially, with the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities. The boarding house was rarely without guests, and Elisabeth had established a small lending library in one of the parlors, fulfilling a dream she'd had since childhood. Levi had indeed found his place as both a deputy sheriff and the town's schoolteacher, splitting his time between keeping the peace and educating the growing population of children. The restlessness that had driven him for so many years had eased, replaced by a deep contentment in the life they'd built together. As she watched her husband lift their laughing son from the pony and spin him around, Elisabeth thought of how far they'd come from that smoke-filled day when fate had thrown them together. The journey hadn't been without challenges. There had been droughts and harsh winters, economic struggles, and the occasional outlaw passing through. But through it all, they had kept their eyes on the light ahead, moving forward together into a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. In finding each other, they had found not just love, but purpose, community, and a sense of belonging that neither had known was possible. And that, Elisabeth reflected, as Levi looked up and smiled at her with the same warmth that had first captivated her years ago, was the greatest treasure of all.